Well, welcome, and thanks for being here. We're going to talk a little bit about security and policy, and I thought I'd kick it off with just a few introductions. So I'll let you guys introduce yourself. Introduce yourself. We can start with Maya.
Sure. I'm Maya Katrowski. I'm a product manager working on software supply chain security at GitHub.
Nice. Amit?
Hello, my name is Amit Gupta. I run product management and business development at Tigera. We're a company behind Project Calico. We do networking, network security, and observability for Kubernetes-based environments.
Nice. And Jonathan?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Hunt, VP of Information Security at GitLab.
Awesome. So I thought with the debates going on in America, lots of interesting, I thought we'd start with a controversial topic. So I'll go back, I'll start with Jonathan. Tabs or spaces?
I guess I'd have to go spaces.
Spaces, oh, this is interesting. So we have GitLab and GitHub, so we'll get the official corporate points of view. Amit, tabs or spaces?
Tabs.
Oh, wow. So already a controversial panel. This is good. And Maya?
I don't know what the official point of view is, but I use spaces.
Whoa, 2-1 on spaces. This is terrible. Oh my God. We're going to split the Supreme Court. We're going to split here too. So that's awesome. Okay, so we're warmed up now. I thought we'd just start with an interesting thing. I saw in the news yesterday that Universal Health Services, had a breach yesterday. It's actually the largest healthcare breach, of medical records ever in the U.S. So security is definitely on the mind of everybody's topic. But I just thought we'd start with kind of an open-ended question and talk about, really what are some of the emerging threats that people see around security and policy. And if you were building, a team today, from scratch, and you could sort of design your all-star dream team to think about, security and policy from the beginning, and sort of lock it into your culture, what are some of the things that you'd look for? So I'll start with Maya.
Yeah, I think there is certainly a shift, and I hate already using this term, but around adding security to DevOps. So exactly almost what you were just saying around making security part of your culture. The idea of having a separate security team and a separate set of people who's responsible for implementing certain controls is kind of changing, right? Obviously, you still have a security team, you still have application security reviewers or InfoSec people or whatever, but everyone is involved in your security decisions. Everyone's involved in actually improving the security of your organization. So one of the emerging trends, I would say, in that space is just embedding security in as part of the development pipeline, having all developers have some of that knowledge and tooling.
Amit, anything to add or build on?
Yeah, absolutely. So Eric, I agree with you that the security landscape, specifically the threat landscape, is getting more and more sophisticated. And as the applications are being re-architected, to your point, the security as a function has to be involved as part of the DevOps pipeline as early as possible in the build pipeline. Now, security has to evolve as a enabling function, and as a result, these security teams, they really just have to provide all enablement and everything needed for these ops teams, the DevOps teams, to be able to enforce, define, and implement those security controls. So I absolutely agree with what Maya you mentioned, that security has to be part of the DevOps function, and you gotta hire for talent that actually has some level of education and experience building, designing, implementing some security controls in addition to the ops functions.
Jonathan?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a bit of a different perspective on this question. What I can tell you is that what I've seen is that from 10 years ago to today, I'm seeing a lot less, we're going to try to break into your network through like brute force attacks, and we're going to try to hack our way in and move laterally across to your database and export all this data out. And what we're seeing, and what I've seen over the last several years, is more by ways of abusing or misusing or exploiting the services that you actually provide legitimately, right? And so what we're seeing is an increase in abuse of CI runners, crypto mining, other ways to exploit our platform. And you kind of kicked off the question by asking about the dream team. And what I can say is, much like the other companies being represented on this panel, we take security very seriously, and we are fortunate enough. I'm fortunate enough to have been able to build out a significant size security organization at GitLab. And so the two things that I did was, and which might be helpful to some of you, is I've built a security research team and a red team to address two different ways of approaching the same problem. So the security research team is designed to sort of like identify the latest threats, the latest 0 days, the latest exploitations, determine how they can be used to affect our service, and then drive those to mitigation. Whereas the red team then is continuously planning and launching sort of like complex multi-chain campaigns against our service and platform using these threats and techniques that are being discovered by the security research team. And so their attempt is to move the theoretical into reality. And so far, it's really led to building trust with our customers, building trust with the community, and hopefully mitigating a lot of real threats and vulnerabilities against our platform.
Nice. So one thing I thought that would come up in the first round of answers, but I'll make it explicit, is is one of the changes now is that the cloud is kind of at least in my career has sort of changed how we think about certainly the security perspective and how we construct teams. And so I'll sort of throw out a softball-like question, like, what things has the cloud changed? What things has the cloud sort of made easier? What things has the cloud made harder? I'll toss it over to Maya.
Sure. I think lots of things have changed, and also nothing has changed. So I think a lot of the threats and things that we see are not notably different than before. That your infrastructure, like application issues that you might have, basics that everyone's annoyed with, but we still have like cross-site scripting, like those are still around for some reason, right? Unpatched servers, whatever it happens to be. I think what changes for me with the cloud, and as people kind of move towards newer architectures in general, is a lack of understanding of what's actually in your environment. I think that makes a huge difference in terms of like, if you went from having a data center that you ran and you knew exactly what was running there because somebody had to provision it who worked on your team, versus you have different sets of developers running in different clouds, using different architectures, using different frameworks. It's a lot more for one security team to understand. I think so. The first part is understanding what you actually have. Like that's much harder with the cloud. And that's I would say a negative in some sense for security, in the sense that you don't necessarily understand your risk because you don't actually understand what you have. And then conversely, I think where the cloud does really well is arguably, short of a handful of very large companies, your cloud provider is more secure than you are. So choosing to move a workload to a data center run by one of the large cloud providers probably actually gets you a lot of benefits that you wouldn't have otherwise. You'd have some automated patching of your hardware, some maintenance that's taken care of for you, right? Notifications if there's security issues that are taken care of for you, lots of things that are automated on your behalf. And so you kind of get that all in one bundle where a lot of that specialized knowledge your team doesn't need anymore. Again, the problem being that now you have 2 or 3 sources for that knowledge rather than one source for that knowledge in your environment.
That's great. So Ahmed, just sort of building on some of the things that Maya brought up, are there some unique strengths of the cloud that we can sort of build on and use to our advantage?
Yeah, so I think, just teeing off from what Maya explained, so in a cloud security model, obviously from a shared responsibility perspective, a whole bunch of things are going to be taken care of by the cloud provider. So a whole lot of things a user doesn't have to worry about. But as a user running applications in the cloud, if you're obviously responsible for securing your applications, your usage of the services, and so on. So some of the cloud providers, they do provide a whole bunch of capabilities around how you can leverage some of those knobs to secure your application. But specifically to your question, Eric, one of the things that I believe cloud creates a good architecture and a model is it's a very workload-centric model. So what it forces security professionals to think about is move their security architecture and approach closer to the applications, closer to the workloads. And we certainly see that from a network security perspective, particularly working with our users. I mean, the traditional network security models are not as effective as you go deploy your applications in the cloud. And as a result, designing a security approach that is more tied to your applications and to your workloads is actually a good security architecture, a more effective security architecture. And certainly cloud-based deployments help in that model. Just one additional thing I would highlight is, I mean, it's very likely that if you're deploying cloud-based application, that you've already moved to an architecture approach where you've built resiliency in the application, closer to the application. These are newer architectures, and that, in our opinion, in my opinion, is actually a good pattern. And then you should design your security to that approach as well, not really just rely on infrastructure components where you put gates or gateways or proxies or appliances to secure the architecture.
Cool. I think just to paraphrase Maya in a lighthearted way, I think she gave a little bit of her answer was also like the more things change, the more they stay the same in terms of, everything's changed, nothing's changed. But I think some things have changed for DevOps team or DevOps team. And in the past, when we did releases, I don't know if you remember release checklists, right, of all these things we were supposed to think about before release. And now we're releasing, many of us, multiple times per day. And so it's certainly less of a checklist approach. So as teams think about automating their approach, what are some things that are really top of mind that sort of replace, sort of the final quality checks and how we think about our modern CI/CD pipelines in this way? I'll toss it to Jonathan.
Yeah, honestly, I recommend really working closely with your QA development orgs to identify areas where automation can be a significant benefit. And this can happen in multiple ways, right? So static and dynamic analysis, dependency scanning, all of these things are easily automated at the developer level on their local host or during the SDLC pipeline. So these tools are not only designed to run very quickly, but also speed up your deploy times versus like running manually. And arguably you're more secure, right? As you prevent releasing harmful vulnerabilities, which are obviously exploitable by malicious actors.
Yeah, so I think the other things to think about also, we've spent most of the time thinking about securities, but there's also policy implications too as we make changes to things like GDPR affecting companies and other type things. Are there other specific considerations around policy that people should think about, Amit?
I think I would agree with you, Jonathan. In fact, to add to that, I think when you're defining your policy controls or any regulatory framework that you're subject to for your applications running in cloud or elsewhere, I believe a very effective mechanism is to define these policies or controls or requirements in a declarative model. So you define your policies, could be as simple as, hey, thou shalt not run privileged mode containers in production, or thou shalt not allow egress traffic to 0.0.0, whatever those policies, regulatory frameworks that you follow, and you have translated that into specific technical security requirements. The approach, the more effective approach is you write those controls in a declarative model and then have governance controls around it. So, and it really depends on the organization. We have seen some organizations very effectively do continuous audits around these policies. And if they see violations, there could be actions like, hey, we're gonna kill all deployments that are running containers in privilege mode. That could be one policy requirement. Or we would kill all deployments that are not encrypting traffic inside the cluster, if that's one of the control or requirements you're following from a regulatory framework. Or you can go as far as saying that we would have controls in place that if you do have a privileged mode container, they won't even let you deploy it in the infrastructure. That will be blocked much earlier, right in your pipeline, in your QA processes, or so on. So I think it's very important, and it's also effective. You take those regulatory requirements from GDPR or whatever framework your organization is subject to, define those into technical requirements, and then figure out collaboratively working with your dev teams and security teams, like what approach you're going to take to enforce those requirements. Are those guidelines or hard frameworks that you need to adhere to? Because without that, you're subject to some kind of significant violations or penalties.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. I think all of us have sort of talked about how it's really important to sort of work together and bring in, various team members, whether they're security experts or QA experts, but when the rubber hits the road, I'll toss this one to Maya. What is the actual best way to engage security and policy stakeholders in the group? They may not be, as technical as some of the developers, and yet, we need to work together. What is the best way to actually make sure that everyone's point of view is represented?
I don't know that I have the best way, but I think there is a need to obviously separate requirements from the controls that you put in place. So there are some regulations that have very strict controls that define very explicitly what they need to be. So like HIPAA, for example, if you were to lose healthcare information that was not encrypted, that would have consequences. Now, HIPAA doesn't say encrypt healthcare information. It says if you lose it and it wasn't encrypted, then there's a different penalty than if you lost it and it was encrypted. So like you have to translate that set of requirements into what's actually important for your organization and what that actually means for your organization. I see that for things like dual control, encryption requirements, key management is a really common one. A couple other controls where there's so many different ways that you can make this work. It really matters in terms of your organization figuring out what's practical and your auditors agreeing with you as to that control making sense for your particular organization. How to engage between those different teams. I think having a lot of clarity as to what your exact requirements are, documenting them. A common thing to do in a large company would be like a risk register where you actually go and see what all those controls are and then verify that those are being met. But to go back to what Amit was saying, I think that's still, that's the reality of 20 years ago. It's still far from the reality where people are today with the cloud and wanting to have declarative policies that automatically apply to their environments and automatically enforce everything they want in their environments. Right? That's what we all want. The reality is I don't see anyone there yet. I see people hoping to get there. And I guess what I would say in that regard, to me, the first step, obviously, like I said, understanding the controls between your different teams, but like centralizing and having a common way of doing some of the things that you want to do in your organization, right? Like one of the most powerful security controls isn't a security control. It's just having a consistent way that your team writes, builds, tests, and deploys code. Because then you have somewhere to apply any of the controls that you could imagine in your environment, right? Rather than having to apply it in like 5 different places. So engaging, yes, your policy auditors, et cetera, developers, but also your DevOps team or your infrastructure team to make sure you can actually implement what you're setting out to implement.
Yeah, anything to add, Jonathan, in terms of how to actually engage the key policyholders?
Yeah, we have a pretty interesting approach at GitLab. We, as a company, some people may know this. We are we are like radically transparent, and I don't know if I'm allowed to use that terminology, but that's how I phrase the way the company operates. Radically transparent, and what that means is our entire handbook is on the web. We live stream company meetings out to YouTube. We have all these sort of like procedures and processes around ensuring that the tickets and the issues and the projects we're working are open for company visibility. So what I think is important is first, I think Maya did a good job at touching on most of this, but the one thing I would add is I think that one thing you can do is work as best as you can, work rather than like synchronously, like in a meeting, like everybody has to get on a call at 12:30 and we're going to invite 17 people to that call, is try to work as asynchronous as possible. GitLab itself is in 100, we have 1,300 people in over 100 countries, right? Like we can't possibly get everybody onto a meeting, all of our stakeholders on a meeting at the same time. It's literally impossible, right? And so what we try to do is try to work as asynchronous as possible. Also, how many times have you been in a meeting and come away with direction and requirements and tasks, and all of a sudden, oh, we forgot to invite Maya, we forgot to invite Amit, right, to that meeting, and now we've got to start from scratch, right? So first and foremost, work the best that you can asynchronous, opening up, the information, the documentation to all parties, right? Even to the company if you can, because you may not properly identify all the stakeholders from the beginning. And so allowing people the visibility to access those documents, to access those tickets, to access those issues, and be able to provide feedback when, on their time during their workday, I think is highly advantageous. And then the other thing I would say is I think it's important to for people to become better communicators, right? I think a lot of times people jump into meetings and they don't even know, like they don't have a real agenda set. They don't have this is what's expected at this, out of this meeting, right? They'll go into a meeting and they'll say, hey, this is the problem. What do you all think? And then it becomes kind of pardon my terminology, but a waste of 30 minutes or a waste of an hour, right, of everybody's time. I think you have to come in and set expectations and understand what the ask is and what you're intending to accomplish with that meeting, and come away with actionable items and events. And I think that's the best approach to engaging stakeholders and progressing on issues of concern.
Yeah, that was good. You gave some good examples on good things to do and less good things to do, shall we say? I'll build on that going forward. I'd say so. Amit, so the less good things, I'd say that the easiest way to ask the question is, I think we've all seen many companies, moving to the cloud and modernizing their application portfolios. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see customers make, as they go into this transition? And any words of advice on how to avoid these things going forward, for the benefit of sharing our experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if there's one thing I would pick where users trip off or organizations trip off is they put security as an afterthought, and it's not baked in as part of the architecture. And I'll take a couple of examples to cite how it gets really complex, particularly in a modern application infrastructure or architecture. You start with one cluster, a few nodes, 4 or 5 services. It's relatively okay at that point. But as you start to become successful and you're moving to 4 or 5 clusters and you got hundreds of microservices running, many applications potentially in different clouds, at that time, for you to go back and put security controls in place and rethink about the infrastructure, you're just asking for massive amounts of trouble, rework, wasted time, energy, and so on. So if there's one thing I would say, and we have seen this many times with working with many users and customers, that they're hitting outages, they're hitting service incidents to fix some security requirements, but it's kind of too late to start thinking about that. It's a massive overhaul of the infrastructure. So if there's one thing I would say is, if folks can think about security, like secure by design principles, pick whatever principles your organization want to follow. You want to minimize attack surface. You will have multiple layers of defense. You will follow the least privileged model. Whatever those principles you want to follow in your design cycle, think about security at that stage, and it's gonna create a lot more value for you as you further evolve your infrastructure, your applications. You're further in your journey. You'll actually be able to address evolving security requirements in an effective way if you have thought about those principles early on. So I would say that that's one of the most important things that we have seen our users trip up, and those who do think about that early on definitely benefit from it.
Yeah, Maya, any other sort of classes of mistakes that you see besides designing security and policy controls up front?
I think one is in terms of rollout to different parts of the organization or different levels of control, let's say. I haven't seen anyone successfully turn on enforcement from day one. Not to say it's not possible, but I'd love to see it. So the way that I see people typically do this would be, almost like a dry run, like what's going on in my organization, where am I not passing policy? Okay, let me go follow up with those teams, understand why, understand if they should be in scope, or understanding if they need more help, becoming in scope, or actually addressing the control, whatever it happens to be, and then I can go ahead and enforce that requirement going forward. So it's not something you can just turn on without going to engage all of the people who might have that control affect them directly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's important. We actually added soft enforcement specifically so that people can turn it on day one, even if it's only reporting. And I agree. The better you get a visualization of what's going on, the sooner you can figure out how to address it. What are some considerations for organizations in terms of, should you use the cloud? Should you go a third party? Should you actually host your own? How do sort of people make that decision? And what's your sort of best prescriptive guidance for them?
I think it really depends where your data is and what you're trying to control, right? If you're using 3 different cloud providers, using 3 different policy systems, one for each cloud, doesn't seem like the best plan. Again, you can tell me otherwise, that you've tried it out and it worked, but I haven't seen anyone really do that successfully. So people will turn to third-party tools, config as code, infrastructure as code tools. We're talking about the declarative models that people are going towards. Sometimes also people don't care in some sense. Like if the core part of my application is having, running some compute workload, and I really care about what's happening at the application layer, but I am a little bit more lax about what's happening at other layers, I might not put in place such strict controls because I don't give my developers direct access to that. So it's about also controlling the things where you have people who have access to change those controls, right? If you only have one person who handles compute provisioning and that person knows what they're doing, maybe you don't need to enforce controls there and they can just go update things themselves, right? So it's more about being smart with what you have and how big your team is than anything else.
Yeah. John, any thoughts on that topic? Or?
Yeah, honestly, to add to what Maya said, I tend to get a little prescriptive in the very beginning. I don't like she sort of referenced, right? There's not really a one size fits all, right? There's not just a right and wrong answer to this. What I try to do is from the beginning, when I'm thinking about managed versus self-managed or third party, service provider, whatever, I think about 3 things really. I think the first thing I'm doing is I think about who can do it better. Right? Can we do it better? Does the hosting provider do it better? Is there a third-party service or a third party that does it better? And what I'm doing in that scenario is I'm considering buying expertise. Right? That's what I'm buying is expertise. The second thing I'm thinking about is honestly, unfortunately, cost. Right? You have to think about the cost of a managed service. Or the hosting provider provided service versus total cost of ownership of running your own solution. And that isn't just the cost of building, but operating and maintaining and updating, all that goes into what you would consider TCO, right? And the last thing I think about is, can my team's time be better spent on more complex issues versus what might be considered like the trivial routine work, right? Essentially, what is the opportunity cost?
Anything to add to this topic as well, or Amit?
I think I agree with what Maya said, and Jonathan, you mentioned. I mean, one of the things that we do see is depending on a user's environment, if they have heterogeneous infrastructure, if they have complex environments, they may not be able to rely on the cloud-native tools available. So they may choose to a third-party solution and design an architecture that's agnostic to cloud providers.
Yeah.
I think there's also a difference to kind of add on to what you were all saying between the controls that I can use versus what I actually, templatize or implement, right? Like if a cloud provider does not make a particular control available, accessible via an API, you are limited, unfortunately, in terms of how you can use that particular control, right? Versus you might choose to buy the expertise of someone who's already implemented a PCI, and that doesn't necessarily mean using a particular solution, but using that expertise as to what might work across the solutions that you have. So you are going to be limited also by the nature of what's possible based on whatever environment you're choosing to run in.
Fair point. So let's switch it around a little. Let's say you've worked together, you've made great tools choices, and you have a security issue. What are things that corporations should think about in terms of responding? When an issue comes up, it may be your first time facing a security issue or policy issue. I don't know if you remember the first time in your career, Maya, when this sort of came across your desk. I know it's that email you don't want to open in your mailbox. But what's some advice that you have for people watching the first time that they actually encounter an issue? How do they deal with it? What steps should they take?
I'll jump in. I mean, hopefully you have an incident response team whose job it is to deal with these kinds of issues. A couple things to point out. There's a difference between an issue that's a vulnerability, that's something that is a problem with your environment or your configuration, et cetera, that no one's actively exploiting, and a security incident where someone's actually doing something bad actively in your environment, or that you've lost data, or that you've eroded customer trust, et cetera. Like those one is more urgent than the other, right? It might seem urgent to patch a critical vulnerability, and it is, but that's a different reaction and a different team and a different model than, hey, I've lost customer data, right? They're different scenarios. So I'm going to assume we mean the security incident, shit's on fire, let's go deal with that right away. Again, hopefully you have an incident response team. If we're working on the cloud, because I'm assuming that's the situation that we're in today, make sure you understand the responsibility model of the cloud. There's probably some information that the cloud provider can give you for that incident as well. The first phase you're going to be in is going to be in a sort of collecting information phase, finding all the logs, events, audit history of what happened in that area, and figure out what's actually affected, what's the scope of the problem. You might be doing that simultaneously while you're actually trying to stem the bleeding. So whether that's change firewall rules or kill the service or whatever happens to make sense in that particular situation, apply patch, et cetera, to address the issue. So collect information while you stem the bleeding. Once you have information, you might have a better idea as to how to actually go address and fix that problem, and then you can go do so. And then again, depending on what ended up happening, you might have to notify customers. There might be, rotating of passwords within your environment, et cetera, depending on what information was compromised. I think it's really important also after the fact to do a postmortem and understand why this happened and what happened, so that you can put in place different controls or second layers of controls to help prevent this from happening again in the future.
Yeah. Jonathan, anything to add for when your hair is on fire?
I honestly cannot put it any better than what Maya just did. But I would say this. Everything she said, please try to do it before an event actually happens. Try to figure out who you need to go to, what teams do what, who's responsible, what the on-call numbers are, what your third party, if you need to get the worst case scenario, you need a forensic investigator, you need to reach out to this whatever agency, right? Have all that in place, ready to go, do tabletop exercises, run through scenarios, know what your DR strategy is, know what your BC strategy is, disaster recovery and business continuity, in case people aren't familiar with those acronyms. Know how to get in touch with your TAMs at your hosting provider. Do that ahead of time. And when the events happen, ensure people have access to that information, that document, if it's in a handbook or some other location. Just make sure engineering and support and IT and security and infrastructure and development, everybody has access to that information, knows where it's at, knows how to get there, and then do exactly what Maya just said.
And to add to that, have some redundancy, right? Like if part of your problem might be like you operate Slack ops and Slack is down, and Slack is also how you communicate with everybody else in your team, maybe you need another way to communicate with everybody else in your team during an emergency.
Yeah. All right. So we all agree Maya gave an excellent answer, but anything you want to pile on and add, Amit?
I would say hopefully people were taking notes. Those are two good examples, like pretty good playbook to how you manage your incidents. So I have nothing to add to that.
Yeah, so Maya, you brought up something in your answer to, I want to come back to. You brought up the concept of review or postmortems. And so we sort of have this concept of blameless postmortems. And I kind of, I'll throw out the provocative question. Do blameless postmortems really exist in the real world? And what are the lessons that that people can take away? And what is the best advice we have to people when they're doing these reviews and trying to take the learnings and apply them going forward?
Yeah, so I think they do exist. That being said, I'm biased. I used to work at Google, which I think invented the concept of blameless postmortems.
Yeah.
Now I'm at GitHub. They do exist in the real world, and they apply both to security and also to like operational incidents and that kind of thing, right? I think it's particularly important to realize that humans make mistakes, and when a mistake happens, like the human can say sorry and can like change their behavior and can learn how to do it differently. But a new human is going to come along and do the exact same thing unless we fix the actual system, right? I had an incident that I remember where we accidentally made some customer data public that shouldn't have been public. We contacted the customer and told them. The person who was responsible for this said, "Let me personally apologize." And I was like, "No, like this is not your fault. Like the fault is that the system let you make the data public. We should go fix the system." And so that to me is the learning and the takeaway from this is like, how can you make everything easier for your humans, because you have a limited number of humans and they're going to keep making mistakes. So how do you prevent the system? How do you make the system prevent them from doing things that they shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, wise words. Anything you want to build on in reviews and actions to take on it?
And I agree with Maya. And the couple of things I would say is, as you're doing your postmortems for security or operational incidents, review the entire workflows, do a very comprehensive evaluation of your tools and systems. Don't just restrict the evaluation or the postmortem to where you actually saw the symptoms. The chain of reaction or flow could be 4 systems downstream or upstream in the process. So take an approach where I would say just don't go with the prejudice, or don't go with the mindset that, hey, here's where we saw the problem, so we got to go around here. These systems are complex; they're already connected. So go with an open approach and look deeper elsewhere for the root cause. Because if you just fix the symptom, you're gonna 2 months later may land up in the same situation and may not be able to recover there.
No, I think that's a good point. I think one of the things that I'll share a personal anecdote on my side. We actually got to test some of our business recovery plans because of COVID, right? Because no one was in the office, and because we had a different set of tools, and we got to check our redundancy tools and sort of some of our planning. It wasn't something we intended. I think we probably would have run a different style of fire drill, but it was a test, so we sort of took advantage of it. And we sort of hinted around it in the beginning, Jonathan. I in preparing, I kind of looked at some of the work that you guys have done. A lot of us are working from home now. I can tell by some of your backgrounds they don't look very Tigera-ish or GitHub-ish or GitLab-ish, and I'm sure a lot of people watching this now are watching from their homes. Is there anything that people should think about in terms of protecting their infrastructure and services? I noted when I did my searches preparing for the thing, I noted that GitLab did a phishing test on their employees when they were working from home, and actually 1 in 5 employees actually fell for the phish, which I don't know if people were happy or unhappy. But that type of auditing and stuff is like a concrete action that we can take. But any advice to organizations that are working remotely and haven't thought about the security and policy implications, Jonathan?
Yeah, the first piece of advice, and granted, I may be, with a disclaimer, I may be a bit rusty. I've been working remotely for 6 years now, so this is pre-pandemic. But if I could give a piece of advice for companies that have moved remote, for obvious reasons, one thing that they may have not thought about or forgotten is ultimately one significant part of security is threat landscape and reducing the threat landscape. So if you think about the infrastructure that's still running in a data center somewhere, where you had this network domain and all this access to your AD servers and LDAP servers, I would consider disabling or suspending services that are no longer being utilized inside a network that was once connected to from a desk or an office somewhere inside your building. But that said, working remotely, this day and age, most people have created external access to their environments, to their production environments. Teams go on call, right? People go on vacation. Teams are on call 24/7. Events happen in the middle of the night. They have to get up. They're CERT engineers, their infrastructure engineers, the IT teams have to connect remotely. I guess in the most simplistic form is obviously make sure you're thinking about a couple of the best practices, right? Make sure I certainly recommend using an encrypted VPN. I certainly recommend the principles of least privilege, right? And ensure that. So ensure that, and in addition to that is MFA, right? Make sure you have multi-factor authentication turned on. So as your workforce has moved remote, it adds a layer of complexity from connecting in an office to connecting in everybody's homes on personal networks using what could potentially be secure, insecure methods or secure, insecure Wi-Fi, maybe they're the Starbucks. So I think VPN, I think MFA is really important in ensuring you're reviewing access from external, from the external parties.
Yeah, Alan, anything to add to Jonathan about us all working remotely?
I think those are good. Those are definitely good tactics. I would add that, if we just stay with the example, Eric, you were mentioning that 1 out of 5 employees fell for the phishing attack. See, the other thing to account for is as you're designing your security architecture for this new way of working, think about your blast radius, think about the trust domains for the user. So just like a good developer, you think about your fault domain for the application. Similarly, from a security perspective, if that user falls for a phishing attack, what's the blast radius for that compromise in the environment? And if you follow some of the things, Jonathan, you mentioned, you could easily contain those compromises and have literally no exposure to your infrastructure or your environment, even if one of those users get compromised.
Cool.
Yeah, to add on to some of that, I think the 20% phishing rate is pretty good. I think that's like industry standard roughly. So that's not something for people to be upset of if they see something similar in their environments. The two strongest things I would do there are obviously MFA and just make it okay to ask questions. Like for someone who's working from home and who doesn't have contact with the security team, where do they go ask a question of hey, someone called me claiming to be from IT. It's the same commotion that we have with people working from home is what we're going to have with the US election, where someone calls you up and tries to scam you into doing something, right? Everything has changed for everyone. We know that, make it okay, make it easy for someone to get information.
Yeah.
I think it's also the kind of the opportunity is anyone who had a Beyond Corp plan on the backlog is probably picking it up and dusting it off and going, how do I do Beyond Corp again? So it's the idea of instead of using a VPN, having different trust levels for your applications, your internal applications, and using things like IP addresses and times and machine identities, et cetera, to then access, to determine if a user should be able to access a particular application. So I think that's also a trend that I'm seeing pick back up. Not that it ever went away, but kind of pick up back up in force for more modern corporations.
If I could add one more thing too. So I think what we can do better as security leaders, as security orgs, is, let's not just wait for once a year to have this little 15-minute, security awareness training video and check a box and now we're SOC compliant, everything's good, right? Check the box items rarely, I think research has shown that rarely improves an organization's security posture. So just keep security top of mind. What I try to do at GitLab at past companies is I send out just email updates. I send out Slack channel updates like, hey, just a reminder, take a quick look at, at this phishing handbook page or something and how you can protect yourself. I try to send something out around the holidays, right? I try to send something out when there's a trend or an increase in the industry of certain types of attacks or malware or phishing attempts or whatever it is, or spear phishing, right? And just trying to keep security top of mind, I think is important. And if you can manage it, and I know it's difficult to do, but if you can manage it, it'd be nice if you had, if you could maintain regular security training versus just like, oh, go watch this video 15 minutes and you're done for the year. Maybe figure out a way to incorporate security training into other types of, policy refresh, or, maybe in your, maybe when you do a like a GDPR video or something, where you have to do like some sort of GDPR training, it'd be nice to throw some security stuff into that. Or, code of conduct policy, it'd be nice to throw some security stuff into that. Oh, take a look at the acceptable use policy, by the way, like you have to sign off on that as well. And just let us know if you have questions. So I just think keeping it top of mind is important.
Yeah. No, definitely good advice. So we're kind of running out of time. So let me close with one last question. So that's sort of in a different vein in terms of our responsibility. I think the thing I think is fun to sort of speculate on is, there's all this new technology coming. And so I'll just like to throw out, what are some future technologies and trends that you see, cloud vendors and the industry taking advantage of to make all of our jobs easier with respect to security and policy going forward? So I'll start with Maya. I'll run down the panel one more time, and then we'll wrap it up.
I don't know. That's a tough one. I'm thinking of it right now. I have more problems. I don't know that I have more solutions for you immediately. That's
okay. You could articulate the order in which we should work on them. That's okay.
Some of the other problems that I see people starting to care about that they didn't care about before, like things like firmware security, where it's like, oh, I had all this hardware and it was great when I knew what all my machines were, but now that we're working from home and now that I have things in 3 different data centers and a private cloud and there's like this layer across my entire organization that I know nothing about. So that's an interesting problem, I think, for me, that I'm like, I wonder what people are going to be doing in that space.
Yeah, trusted supply chain, provenance, all important topics. Any future trends that excite you or you think that users will benefit from shortly?
I think definitely we come from the Kubernetes world, so certainly I'm closer to those environments. It's a great infrastructure, it's a great architecture approach, building your application in a microservices-based environments. I think the one thing I would say the users should definitely plan on their roadmap is bringing security closer to the workload, specifically in a network security environment. You will see, if you're not already there as in your deployment, that your workloads are going to grow, and you will be beyond just that 2, 4, 5 clusters that you're running. And as you grow and become successful, it's going to become harder and harder to design security if you're following what we call as a traditional enclave model, where there are gates some places and everything has to pass through those gates. So go away from those approach, bring it as closer to the workloads. And I understand it may not be as straightforward or as easy for you to take incremental approach, but definitely start moving in that direction, because that's really the most scalable, most effective, and most cloud native way to secure your environments.
Yeah, Jonathan?
Yeah, 2 words: world domination. And what I mean by that, no, but for real though, honestly, the trend we're seeing all across the world, regardless of industry, regardless of professional, personal space, is an aggregate, like a complete solution, an aggregate of services. So I see, what do I see? I see AWS, I see GCP, I see Microsoft Azure. I see these companies adding more and more solutions to their platform that's going to be like a one-stop shop, right? Isn't that what we're trying to do? Many of us are trying to do with the product and services that we offer, right? Amazon started off as a bookstore, and look where it's at today, right? So I think that's what I see happening in the next 10 to 20 years, is just an increase in an already expansive set of service solutions embedded into the hosting platform.
Nice. Well, thank you,
I have
Paul.
I'm a positive one now. I'm ready.
One more. Okay.
The use of open source. So I think I sort of, I got it, but I didn't get it until a couple years ago, where it's like you can really put in, say your team is 3 application security people, right? You can spend one person's worth of time, and if they contribute that time to an open source project and use that open source project, they get back 10 engineers worth of time, based on like people building features that they need that work with their environment, et cetera, right? So again, assuming you don't go down a super bespoke path, the rise of open source security tools, it's just everyone's gonna be, we don't have that many in the grand scheme of things that do security, but we're gonna have more and more and more open source security tools.
Yeah, I just want to cover myself just in case AI overlords are reviewing this video in 20 years. I'm totally on your side and respectful of you. So that insurance is in my pocket. I want to thank you guys for spending some time with us, sharing your thoughts and best practices overall. And I wish you all a good day. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Thank you.
Pulumi is the modern infrastructure as code platform that empowers cloud engineering teams to define cloud resources using their favorite programming languages, including JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, .NET, and Go. By using familiar programming languages instead of templates or domain-specific languages, teams can now manage cloud resources using the same tools, libraries, and workflows that they use to write their applications. This means Pulumi works with your preferred source control management system and IDE with full linting, debugging, testing, and code review capabilities at your fingertips. Pulumi integrates with popular CI/CD platforms so that your infrastructure deployments can be gated and deployed in the same pipeline as your applications, ensuring your infrastructure is ready to support new application features before you push them to production. Pulumi has over 40 integrations with leading software tools and popular SaaS platforms, so you can stand up all of the capabilities your team needs in the cloud, on Kubernetes, and on-prem. It even supports sophisticated hybrid deployments. Pulumi provides an open source SDK and CLI for your development team and offers both free and commercial SaaS products to help you manage infrastructure state, user roles, infrastructure policies, and more. With Pulumi, you can deliver quickly, deploy confidently, operate securely, and scale easily. Try it today at pulumi.com.